Chair now recognizes Mr. Donovan from New York for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'd like to thank my colleague from South Carolina, because I was elected to office 13 months after Superstorm Sandy, and I had to create a one-stop shopping for the residents of Staten Island and South Brooklyn that were affected by that storm. So I agree with you, sir. I was always a believer, gentlemen, that government should have less interference in people's lives, but we ought to do certain things. We ought to pick up people's garbage. We ought to protect our communities with our police and our nation with our armed forces. And we ought to come to our citizens' relief at the time of a disaster. Over the past weeks, my staff has been collecting stories from constituents who were affected by Superstorm Sandy. I represent Staten Island and the southern portion of Brooklyn. And these people are still struggling to recover from the disaster, in part because of the difficulties they have navigating through the complex recovery programs. We will be sharing these stories with your office, and I hope that together we can work to ensure that similar situations do not occur if and when the next disaster we face comes about. I'd like to tell you about a woman, Carolyn Lauer. She's 72 years old, a constituent of mine who, like so many others, had invested her life savings in her home and had just managed to pay off her mortgage months before Superstorm Sandy struck our community. As a result of Sandy, her home was destroyed. Following instructions from FEMA, she immediately after the storm took out an SBA loan for $126,000 to pay for the repairs of her home. Now, she was grateful for the loan, but shortly afterwards, after she took out that new mortgage, grants became available in the type that would repair her home. The fact, though, is she was ineligible because she took out the SBA loan. She is now 72 years old and burdened with a new mortgage, but was never informed that by taking out the SBA loan, she would not be available for the future grants from the Federal Government. Mr. I just don't know whose responsibility it is, and I'm not saying it was yours or your agency's, but whose responsibility do you believe it should be to inform people that if, as my colleague from South Carolina said, people took out an SBA loan, they then would be ineligible for future grants when their neighbors who did not take out SBA loans were eligible for these grants?
Well, I have to look into the direct case. It really depends upon at the point they filed and the SBA was made available. During the initial response, there was no supplemental funds. There was no additional funds for HUD. So at that point, that probably was the best information we had. Later, when Congress, several months later, passed the Sandy supplemental, you provided substantial funding to HUD. And I'm not sure if these were the funds they're referring to, but HUD then made available to the state. And the states then determined, the governor, how to administer those funds. And in many cases, they looked at those funds to elevate or repair structures that were uninsured. But at that point, the timeline was when the initial application was made, FEMA grants were limited to a very small amount of money, about $33,000, and that's not going to make repairs. And the SBA was probably what was available. Now, if we knew that the supplemental was going to come through and that would be the decision being made, it would have been easier to bring all that together. But I think because of the time lapse, that was part of the challenge, that many of these longer-term recovery funds came in after a lot of the initial assistance was being made. We roughly saw and distributed about $1 billion in immediate assistance, whether it was rental assistance or other direct payments, in about the first 35 days. So a lot of things were happening to help people that may have predetermined what would be available as other programs came on later. And I think this goes back to your point and also being raised here. We tend to approach disasters because FEMA's programs don't make people whole. That's a given.
That's correct.
We're just basically the beginning of that. Other federal programs, which historically have provided that assistance, such as HUD, in rural areas, the Farm Service Agency, and others have programs that states can use in disasters, although they're not specifically designed for that on the front end. And then through the appropriation process, we usually give them more authority to do that. But now you're coming in as agencies and pieces. And so where we have this on the front end, we try to bring everybody together and work with the state on the longer-term recovery of bringing those programs together and looking at gaps. But it's still a challenge, and as we saw with Sandy, because of the length of time from the initial impact before some of these programs kicked in, I wouldn't be surprised, but I hope you've given my staff that we'll look into this and see what did happen and what was the cause of it.
Yeah, the majority of the stories that we've collected have to do with the SBA loans, so we will share those with your staff. And I look forward to maybe a time, I know this is a difficult time to speak one-on-one, but maybe at some point in the future we could sit down and speak about that. My time is up, Madam Chair. I yield the rest of it, but I hope that we do have a second round of questions.
Yeah, we will have a second round. Thank you. The